Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you Maigret and the Wine Merchant by Georges Simenon. And what is any sort of mystery channel? How can it be complete without at least one video about Simenon, who wrote approximately, it's guesstimated, about 400 to 450 books, of which 75 or so are in the Inspector Maigret series. And so that is the book I will talk about here, one of the Inspector Maigret books. Many of you know that Simenon was a Belgian man, but often set his work in France. And a lot of his books sort of didn't come to America's attention probably until maybe the 60s or 70s, whereas he had been writing since, very early or quite a bit earlier in the 20th century. So, we are very happy to have him. He is definitely a classic. I like the cover design here too. Interesting. There's the dead wine merchant, the corpse in the casket here, has a very detailed 4 bullet holes in his torso, and that exactly matches the book. And even, I should just show you, there's some embossing on the front cover. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see the 4 bullet holes there as well. So how is that for a nice amount of attention paid to creating a physical book? So for those of you who don't know, which I imagine is very, very few, Inspector Maigret is an inspector, police inspector, homicide inspector in Paris. And all of his books take up about, I'd say, anywhere from 160 to 180 pages. They're very short, 7 or 8 chapters. Some believe that it took Simenon 10 or 11 days to write an entire book, and even he said that he wrote them for the masses, and he didn't mean that condescendingly. He just wanted them to be accessible to all. So he didn't use overly sophisticated vocabulary. He just wanted them to be enjoyed by all. And he thought that he had done a good job if someone read one of his books in 2 nights, which I always do. They're 2-night books for me. So the interesting thing about Maigret is he's so well known and so respected, and yet we don't really know a lot about him as a person. We know that he is a very good policeman. We know that he ponders the crimes quite a bit. They get to him in a way that, it's not just him, solving a crime and moving on. They all sort of seem to leave a lasting impression on him. As he's working on them, he's looking at not only the logistics of plot and story, but also characters and social mores and other interesting philosophical things that are there beneath the surface, but maybe don't strike you over the head. FYI, his first name, which is rarely used, is Jules, or Jules, we would say in English. And his wife is almost always referred to as Madame Maigret. Her first name is almost never used, but I believe it's Louise. And but she's always Madame Maigret, and she is just sort of this very lovely, supportive wife to him. They have a good marriage. They're like the nuts and bolts of their marriage, interestingly, are conducted over food, right? They love eating together. Madame Maigret is a good cook. They like going out to eat when they can afford it or they have the time. And so, that old saying, food is love. It really is. It is, I think, in all cultures, right? Who does not, what culture does not want to get together with their friends and loved ones to eat? It's just, food is love. And food is love here in Maigret's life as well. And that gives him a very nice sense of reality too. But you don't know a lot about his background or where he comes from or whether he has siblings or his relationship with his parents. He's just very much there for the 160 pages of the book. And you get little bits and pieces of him, like little chips of diamond in each book. And it's almost like, you remember Jane Austen used to say that her books were, 2 inches of ivory. She was writing about the world she knew, which was, 2 inches long. And I think that the Simenon books are 2 inches of ivory too, because they're very focused. There's no wild tangents. There's no subplots. It's just one story, and and get on with it. So this one starts with a little bit more of a bang than I find to be the case normally with Maigret books, which is in the opening chapter, Maigret is interviewing a young man who has just bludgeoned his grandmother to death for a couple of francs. I mean, you can tell there's something not quite right about this kid, and he's got no remorse about, having just killed his grandmother. I mean, I guess an early portrayal of what we would now call a sociopath. And it's described in a rather horrifying detail. I mean, I wouldn't say it's bloody and gory, but it is a little bit. But you know what's going on, and so Simenon just grabs you with that from the beginning. It reminds me a little bit of the way Del Shannon / Leslie Egan describes crime in her books, where it's a very kind of clinical description or reportage of what happened that doesn't linger over the details, but wants you to know that these ugly things do happen in the world. And I believe Del Shannon also wrote her books in about 10 days and got a lot of critical flack about it, as well as for many other aspects of her writing. But there's a Del Shannon video here on Forgotten Mysteries if you want to check that out. But maybe there are some surface similarities between Del Shannon and Georges Simenon, but they don't hold up to close scrutiny. So what happens, though, is the story of this teenage murderer rather quickly falls to the side when a murder is announced, as they would say in an Agatha Christie book, that a wealthy wine merchant, his name is Oscar Chabieux, and please all forgive me my French pronunciations. I'm not a Francophile. I mean, not that I don't like the French, it's just I don't speak French, and I'm not full up with their culture, although I do have friends who are committed Francophiles and go to Paris every chance they get. So I'm sort of like, I hear about it secondhand. So Monsieur Chabieux is a wine merchant, and on his way out of a brothel one night, he is shot 4 times through the chest, hence the cover image, and it falls to Maigret to figure out who done it. And the book proceeds in a very much a police procedural fashion, with the police, Maigret and his colleagues, his sort of major domo, Lapointe, figuring out who's got alibis and who's got motives and, the typical police stuff. And it turns out that the number of people with motives here they're just legion, because Chabieux was a really awful person. He's often described as a swine. And we can kind of classify his swinery into 2 major categories. The first one is that he was a sort of a vicious businessman who thought nothing of putting rivals out of business or climbing on top of people to get ahead, to get to the top of his trade. He's very, very wealthy now and very successful, and no one can sort of touch him. And he also is what I guess we would have called back in the day a womanizer. in that he's got many, many conquests, female conquests, in addition to, his wife at home who's aware of the conquests and is like, well, that's him. That's what he needs. It helps him feel better about himself. And this is where I get, this was really kind of the most fascinating part of the book for me. And I guess now is a good time to talk about it, is, they say in Paris that you have lunch with your lover and then dinner with your spouse, right? There seems to be a culture of extramarital affairs or like little love affairs that are always going on behind the scenes that, among a certain class of people, I guess you'd call them the upper middle class, they're just sort of accepted, and each spouse knows the other is getting a little on the side, and it's no big deal. It's just part of who they are. And I guess in America that's not so much a thing. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but it doesn't seem to be like an accepted norm that people go out and do this and live their adult lives having affairs. And it was very interesting for me to read about this. I can't, it's really like if you enjoy reading books about different cultures, this is a little bit of a culture shock if you come from, more of a Puritan background or, a society that doesn't necessarily believe that extramarital affairs are the way to go. And, I might just be a little bit prudish about this because I have a cousin who swears on a stack of Bibles that there's a restaurant a couple towns over from me that is a swingers restaurant, that they have an upstairs lounge with a fish bowl where you can throw your keys and that whole, swinging, partner swapping kind of thing going on. And I tell him, I said, I don't believe a word he says, but he swears on a stack of Bibles that it's true. So, it goes on even in the suburbs. It doesn't have to be among the semi-wealthy of Paris. It could go on in, your basic suburb as well. Again, if my cousin is to be believed, which he probably is. Another interesting thing about this book is the murdered man, Chabu, is, I think we can liken him to what I would call maybe the corporate killer nowadays, or the corporate maven. I mean, probably many of us have worked for companies where we have seen utter psychos claw their way to the top of the food chain. They don't care who they have to step on, who they have to destroy, who they have to elbow out of the way or fire to get to these very high level positions in management. In fact, I had lunch with a couple friends of mine a few months ago, and we were discussing, to get a big job like that in America, do you have to be willing to give up a part of your soul? And it was a serious question, right? Do you have to be willing to say, I'm more than happy to deprive people of their jobs, their livelihoods, hurt them and their families as a way of doing what the corporate overlords want? And I think the answer that we came up with is you have to give up part of your soul, but you probably are you have a bit of a deficit in your soul to begin with if you are willing to do those sorts of things to rise to the top of a corporation. And I had a job like that one time, which I won't get into, but I can tell you it was one of the ugliest things I've ever experienced in my life. I could write a book about it, but it was truly, I said to myself, am I working among human beings, or am I working among demons? Because they felt like the people around me felt demonic. But let's not go off on that tangent. So, even though this book is only 180 pages long, there's really interesting things to think about in it, right? Like I said, the acceptance of extramarital affairs, the the rise to the top of the business world and what that entails, you know, and is that kind of money interesting? What do extramarital affairs even signify or mean? It's in this book, it's hinted that Chabu was never that attractive a man, and that his way of, you know, making himself feel more attractive than he is to take the wives of most of his friends to bed and all of the secretaries in his firm to bed. And for me, what I couldn't get is why all the women went along with that. A lot of them were like, well, you know, I did it to have something to do, or, oh, you know, he was not so bad. He was kind of nice to me. Like, I don't think he's not so bad is a good enough reason to jump into bed with somebody, you know, but that's just me. Like, I would think there'd be some, oh, you know, great chemistry here. Oh, you know, something like saying, well, you're not so bad, so I'll have sex with you. I don't get it. But that's what goes on in here. And that's why I felt a little bit of culture shock. The first part of the book is very much a police procedural. They hit on the person who's probably responsible, I want to say about halfway through. And then the second half of the book becomes about chasing the suspect down or waiting for the suspect to turn himself or herself in. So the second part of the book is a little bit less suspenseful than the first part of the book. But all in all, it's a really good read. It's interesting. Simenon Maigret always have sort of interesting social or personal things to talk about. There's a lot of discussion here or thought about guilt, the concept of guilt and what guilt means, and can one person is one type of guilt worse than another? Are there degrees of guilt? I mean, interesting philosophical discussions. So if you have not read Maigret, I would recommend you go out and find yourself one. I'll admit, the first time I read Maigret was with my book club, you know, 25, 30 years ago. And the one that was chosen didn't really turn me on so much, so I didn't pursue more of them. But as I got older, I started, you know, seeing the books in bookshops and decided to give them another try. And now I am a fan. I like to read, you know, maybe one, you know, Simenon a year, and so I could live to age 450 and still not run out of books to read by him. So that's good if I'm looking for immortality, which I'm not. I do have to tell you, though, there's one quirk of Simenon that drives me crazy, and that is he has his characters repeat their conversations verbatim. So what I mean is, like, say you were having a dialogue between characters, person A and B. On the page, you'd say there would be A, spoken language, then B's response, then A's response, then B's response, right? So it's very, very linear, and you're having that conversation in real time, as it were, as part of the narrative. But what Maigret will, Simenon will do is he'll ask people, he'll have Maigret ask people, well, what happened? And the person will report on a conversation that they had or that they overheard verbatim, right? With every single word intact. That's just not possible. You can't do that. No human being can remember every word in every order that was said between 2 or 3 or 4 conversants. It's just not possible. And he does that fairly regularly. And I think of him as, you know, a neat writer, you know, an organized writer, but I just find that sloppy, quite frankly. It doesn't have to be, you know, you can give the gist of the conversation without repeating it, like I said, word for word. And it always strikes me as weird when I read that, but he does it in all of the Maigret books that I can think of. So just, you know, be aware of that, and I'll be curious as to what you think about it, if it drives you crazy or not when you read the book, or any Maigret book. So I wanted this book to be, this video to be a little bit shorter, like a typical Maigret book when compared to the length of a typical mystery. But as usual, I went on at length. So if you have not read Simenon, check him out. If you read a non-Maigret, those books are often, I think, put in a category of maybe psychological novel or psychological thriller. Some of them are better than others. Some are really terrific. Some of them are kind of ponderous and maybe don't go, don't really go anywhere. But one thing I could say about them, and I've probably read about 20 of his books, is they're always interesting. They're always fast. And what the heck? I mean, they're 170 pages. If you don't like it, you don't have to stick around for very long because it goes kaboom and you're done. Okay, speaking of kaboom and being done, that's it for now. Have a good night.